probably 30 or so. Good morning, and welcome to the second event of VIU's Arts and Humanities Colloquium series for fall 2022. I'm Dr. Tim Lewis, Professor of History here at VIU, and it is my honor to once again be serving as the MC/host for the Colloquium series this year. Before I go any further, please keep in mind that the entire VIU campus and the Nanaimo region as a whole is built on the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation. And as guests on this land, we must always be grateful for the opportunity that we have to live, learn, work, and play in this very special place. So, haishka. If nothing else, that reality should in turn motivate all of us to work to advance the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. As always, the members of the Arts and Humanities Colloquium Planning Committee, headed by VIU English Professor Dr. Theo Finnegan, wish to express our sincere thanks to the Dean of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Marnie Stanley, for her ongoing support of the work of the Colloquium. This series could not continue without the funding and moral support that her office provides. And in recognition of that, I have once again composed this has become a tradition somehow, a little musical salute of sorts to acknowledge Marnie's key role in keeping the Colloquium alive and well. Now, obviously, today's topic, which examines planning policy and how it's impacted housing access and poverty in urban centers in the American state of Kentucky, is a rather serious and important one. So the inspiration for the song kind of reflects the seriousness of the topic. So I've decided to take the American folk classic, Lament 500 Miles Away from Home, which of course tells the story of a person who has been driven from their hometown by poverty and homelessness. Only this morning, 500 miles from home becomes 500 cheers for our dean. So it goes a little like this. If you like the talks we give, you should know how it is we live. We just couldn't do this work without our dean. Without our dean, without our dean, no, we just wouldn't be seen. We just wouldn't be around without our dean. Not a talk could we give, not a thought could we share, if the funding we now have was all stripped bare. So let's give one, let's give two, let's give three, let's give four, let's give 500 cheers for our dean. Yes, let's give 500 cheers for our dean. Thank you. Cheers, Marnie. In the name of time, we'll have to dispense with the other 499 richly deserved cheers. So now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Nancy Pauget from VIU's Department of Graphic Design, as it will be her task to provide the formal introduction for today's featured speaker, VIU Interior Design Professor Katrina Litva. But first, Nancy.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for that, your acknowledgement and introduction. I'm grateful to be here today. And what a beautiful song. I will not be singing, and you'll be thankful that I'm not. Katrina Litva is a professor in the Bachelor of Interior Design program. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Interior Design from the University of Manitoba. Originally from Winnipeg, Katrina moved to Vancouver in the late 90s, then Victoria a few years later, where she ran a successful interior design agency for 25 years. With a long list of government and healthcare clients, Katrina is particularly proud of her work for the palliative care wing at the Saanich Peninsula Hospital. In 2001, Katrina's interest in academics and learning led her to teach at VIU, starting part-time and then transitioning to full-time in 2020. Never one to stay still, Katrina recently took the time to follow her dream of travel and education. She moved to Lexington, Kentucky to attend the University of Kentucky, where she has just graduated with a master's degree in historic preservation. Since 2021, Katrina has made her home in Qualicum Beach with her partner Glenn and her cat Loki. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Kat.
Thank you, Nancy. Welcome, and thank you for attending my presentation this morning on spatial impacts of policy on poverty and affordable housing over time. Just a brief overview about what I'll be talking about this morning. So I'm just going to start with an introduction to historic preservation and providing some examples of preservation at work. I'll briefly discuss my journey to Lexington and the University of Kentucky, and move on to introducing my research and the case study of Louisville, Kentucky. From there, I'll discuss some specific areas of research and briefly discuss the significance and methodology. I'll then move on to a timeline that I used and the laws, policies, and practices, and how they have impacted the neighborhoods under investigation. And I'll introduce you to the 9 historic neighborhoods that I examined, and I'll finish off with an animation of the maps that I created using the census data for each of the demographics I used: race, education, poverty, and median income. So I'm going to start with an explanation of the field of historic preservation for those who may not be familiar with it. Historic preservation, also known as heritage conservation, is an interdisciplinary field of study concerned with the care, use, and interpretation of historic buildings, sites, and landscapes. The field encompasses everything from creative adaptation of older structures. Sorry, I have to keep up with my notes here. To the restoration of examples of high-quality architecture. And here's just another example of a uniquely American-style Richardsonian Romanesque. This is an example in Lexington. It was created by Henry Hobson Richardson in the late 1800s. Historic preservation is also the interpretation of sites associated with historical atrocities. Strong linkages to sustainability and social justice mean that historic preservation plays and will continue to play a vital role in debates about the future of communities worldwide during the coming century. I wanted to give you a couple examples of preservation at work. This is the Lexington Courthouse, constructed between 1898 and 1900. It was a site of the post office and courthouse until 2002, when it moved to a more modern courthouse built along North Limestone. The old courthouse remained vacant for a number of years, but has since been rehabilitated. It now houses event space. Here you can see the restored rotunda, which was hidden for many decades before the restoration. This is Zim's Cafe, a locally owned and operated cafe on the ground floor of the courthouse. And the Thirsty Fox, a restaurant and bar next door to Zim's. Here's an example of a site considered historically valuable to the American people. This is Monticello, home of the 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. It was Jefferson's boyhood home, which he inherited after his father's death. Not only was it Jefferson's home while he was president, but it was also a working plantation with well over 100 enslaved African Americans at any one time worked tending to fields and livestock. This building and site were preserved and restored in the late 1800s after they fell into disrepair. The site is now a house museum and educational institution. Tours have been conducted at Monticello for decades. Preservation's role has changed to become more inclusive, and more recently, the story of the enslaved people who lived, worked, and died at Monticello are being told as a part of its history. The photo on the left is a reconstruction of what the slave quarters would have looked like, as no original structures have survived. Here's an example of a memorial site. This is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened to the public on April 26, 2018, and is the nation's first memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people, people terrorized by lynching, African Americans humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and people of color burdened with contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. More than 4,400 American men, women, and children were hanged, burned alive, shot, drowned, and beaten to death by white mobs between 1877 and 1950. Millions more fled the south as refugees, and this profoundly impacted the entire nation. The memorial site sits on 6 acres atop a rise overlooking Montgomery. The examples we've seen so far, monuments, sites, and buildings, are considered tangible culture. As defined by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, tangible cultural heritage refers to physical artifacts produced, maintained, and transmitted intergenerationally in a society. But historic preservation is more than just the conservation of tangible culture. It also concerns itself with intangible culture. Intangible culture, according to UNESCO, includes oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, knowledge and practices concerning nature and the universe, or the knowledge and skills to produce traditional crafts. I wanted to share with you a great resource for discovering intangible cultural heritage. On UNESCO's website, Intangible Cultural Heritage, the site's listed in the lower left-hand corner, you'll find 3 different ways to discover intangible culture around the world. One way is through this constellation map. You can click on the dots and you'll find documented intangible cultural examples. If you zoom in, you will see some of the smaller points. And I've taken an example in the upper left-hand corner of the map and clicked on handicrafts. Here is a close-up of what it looks like when you zoom in further and you start to see the images of the various examples to explore. When you pick a specific example, you can read a little write-up. This example is the gingerbread craft from northern Croatia. Scrolling down, you'll find a video that describes the process, activity, or experience under investigation. I encourage each of you to take some time to explore this website and discover cultures from around the world. I'd like to change gears now and share with you my journey to Lexington through the discovery of historic preservation and my research at the University of Kentucky. So I took a leave from VIU to get my master's degree in historic preservation and made my way to the University of Kentucky in Lexington. I packed my bags and got Thor and Loki, that's my cat and dog, into my little Prius, and we left Nanaimo, a stop to say goodbye to my family in the Okanagan, and we headed for Lexington, Kentucky. I researched all 42 historic preservation programs in the US, finally deciding on the University of Kentucky. I also researched the cities and found that Lexington is known as the horse capital of the world, and I really like horses, so I thought, why not? Lexington is the 2nd largest city in Kentucky after Louisville, and it has a population of just over 320,000 people. It was founded in 1775, 17 years before Kentucky became a state. Today, Lexington is known for its food, culture, music, great outdoors, and of course, bourbon and horses. My introduction to the world of historic preservation was through coursework, lectures, presentations, and workshops in the field. Here we're hard at work in eastern Kentucky at Pine Mountain, where we worked with traditional stone doing dry stone masonry. Every year, UKHB students would go to Pine Mountain and work on a project. My class finished off some stone steps, and that's the before and after. So I wanted to focus my research in an area other than my background of interiors and buildings, and I challenged myself to take a different direction. Social responsibility and environmental responsibility have always been important. So my desire to understand and address affordable housing is what led me to my master's project research topic. It eventually morphed into my final project, which was a case study of Louisville, Kentucky, looking specifically at 9 historic neighborhoods. And these are the 9 neighborhoods that I looked at, and I'll get into them each shortly. This case study of Louisville, Kentucky, which is a mid-sized city in central Kentucky, addresses how demographics and therefore social and economic conditions have changed over time as a result of policies, incentives, and redevelopment efforts between 1933 and 2017. This was evaluated through the lens of policy decisions like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and subsequent redlining and the Housing Act of 1949, incentives like the national and state historic tax credits, and redevelopment efforts like the downtown revitalization and back to the city movement. This case study illustrates this impact in Louisville by mapping demographics including race, education, and income. I drew inferences by comparing and analyzing census data with the implementation of specific policies. So my research is based in the US, and therefore my data and statistics are American, but I believe it translates well to Canada. Although some of the numbers that you see are lower than, say, the minimum wage that we have, it's sort of proportional, I think, with some of the rents. So the need for affordable housing has always been great. There is a disparity between the classes, which is growing further apart with the middle class shrinking. According to the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, families that pay more than 30% of their income on housing are considered cost burdened. Being cost burdened makes it difficult to afford other necessities like food, clothing, transportation, and medical care. Those that are severely cost burdened pay more than 50% of their income on housing, and it is estimated that there are over 12 million Americans that are currently considered severely cost burdened. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies has published statistics. These are from 2018. In the United States, 47.5% of renters are considered cost burdened, and 25.2% are severely cost burdened. Looking specifically at Kentucky, the numbers are slightly better than the national average, and the total renter cost burden is 41.9%, although that's still a pretty sobering number. And of those 41.9%, 22.4% are considered severely cost burdened. Continuing to look specifically at Kentucky, the fair market rent in 2018 was $821 a month for a two-bedroom apartment in Louisville, Kentucky. In order for this individual to not pay more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities, they would need to earn $15.79 an hour, working 40 hours per week, 52 weeks a year. With minimum wage at $7.25, that minimum wage worker would need to work over 79 hours a week. That's equivalent to 2.2 full-time jobs to afford the fair market rent. It's not difficult to understand then that those working minimum wage jobs and those earning less than $15.79 an hour have difficulty making ends meet. So I did check the numbers. The minimum wage is still $7.25 federally. Some states individually are a little bit larger, but Kentucky is still at $7.25 an hour. And the $15.79 is only slightly more now at $16 and some change. So yearly, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition publishes The Gap, a shortage of affordable housing. This data represents figures published earlier in March of 2019, which are similar to most recent data of 2022, so the numbers are quite similar. It shows that once again, there's a shortage of affordable housing for those that are considered cost-burdened and severely cost-burdened. Many working class American families also fall within that. So those who work in the service industry, like police officers and teachers, for example, also fall under this bracket and find it difficult to find housing. So I'd like to touch on place, health, and well-being. Historic neighborhoods provide a sense of place through those intangible qualities of style, character, and neighborhood history. Identity and memory are linked to place. It's inherent in people's nature to crave connection and personalization to turn space into place. Place can be described as a meaningful location. Sense of place is the subjective and emotional attachment people have to place. Where a person grows up, home, remains a memory long after they've moved away. Each subsequent place they live creates new memories and a sense of attachment. This connection to memory occurs on an individual level and at the neighborhood and community levels. Because there is a correlation between the sense of place and identity, the loss of the sense of place can have negative emotional repercussions. For example, displaced residents lose connection and that part of their identity, which can result in loss of social connections, depression, anxiety, and other physical and mental health burdens. There are 4 significant ways that housing is tied to health. Housing quality can influence illness related to substandard housing, such as lead poisoning, asthma, and injury. Unaffordable housing, as we mentioned earlier, reduces the income available for the other necessities like food, clothing, and healthcare, which results in stress and deterioration of mental health that can increase susceptibility to disease. Physical neighborhood attributes such as walkability, proximity to traffic and public transportation, access to parks and green space, as well as access to healthy food and impact mental health, physical fitness, and nutrition. And lastly, social and community attributes such as concentrated poverty, safety, and segregation can manifest in fear and in physical and social isolation, which further contribute to stress and deterioration of mental health. Those that are most vulnerable, children and the elderly, are also adversely affected by unstable housing conditions. Poor housing conditions create stress that manifests physically and mentally. For example, time spent indoors leaves one susceptible to poor indoor air quality and presence of toxins such as mold and lead paint. Poorly maintained living spaces could result in physical injury such as falls, which are the leading cause of hospitalization among older adults. Location plays an essential role when addressing affordable housing. Historic neighborhoods are often desirable due to their established services and infrastructure. Historic neighborhoods are also inherently walkable, as they are typically built in a mixed-use area incorporating residential, business, and services, all within walking distances of each other. Historically, the mixed-use makeup of neighborhoods allowed residents to walk to nearby services and amenities. Although not the primary goal, this walkability promoted a healthier lifestyle, which remains a benefit for those living in historic neighborhoods. Walkable neighborhoods are those neighborhoods that offer walking access to service and amenities, including transit and incorporate pedestrian-oriented interconnected street networks. So research connects the importance of walkable neighborhoods in relation to various forms of affordable housing, particularly for tenants. One of the things is also many renters don't have, or people who are having trouble with affordability may not have cars. So being out in the suburbs is troublesome as well. So if where we live is central to our identity and integral to good health and mental well-being, it would then follow that everyone is entitled to healthful, affordable housing. In fact, the right to housing is protected in the following laws. Unfortunately, there is a severe shortage of affordable housing for low and middle income households. The connection between health and secure housing has been the subject of many studies that highlight the need for stable housing as a factor of good health. The lack of affordable housing in the U.S. is the result of laws, policies, including but not limited to unfair lending practices, segregation, urban renewal, and large-scale infrastructure. These policies and practices, coupled with the normal flux of neighborhood composition and economic development, can create an environment ripe for gentrification. Although gentrification has become ubiquitous in literature and popular culture, its definition lacks clear consensus. Gentrification was first coined by British sociologist Ruth Glass in the 1960s. What I've come to understand from my readings and the study of the topic is that gentrification and displacement are two different terms. There are those that believe that gentrification means the influx of higher socioeconomic status residents and the outflow of lower socioeconomic status residents to an area. I prefer the decoupling of the terms, whereas gentrification means the influx of higher socioeconomic status residents into an area, with displacement being the outflow of the lower socioeconomic status residents, two different and separate terms. Enough literature and studies have been done to safely say that these two are correlational. My research focused on gentrification in urban areas, but gentrification also exists in the suburbs as well as in rural areas. Much has been written about gentrification, and from my research, some literature suggests these three common causes. First, the commodification of space contends that a neighborhood only has value for what it can become rather than for what it is. Next, polarization power relations, or the divide between the rich and the poor, can lead to gentrification. The greater the divide between these two groups, the easier it is for gentrification to take place. Finally, there is a belief that the potential and vision of a neighborhood is more important than the current neighborhood, which can be destroyed in the process of trying to attain that vision. Other research connects gentrification with location, aesthetics, and social and economic factors. The importance of location is derived from proximity and convenience to employment, commercial, and institutional centers. Aesthetic is derived from the character and quality of historic building stock that easily lends itself to rehabilitation. Rehabilitation of historic properties often proves to be a sound financial investment in real estate. An additional economic factor is the current higher cost of commuting and higher prices for new construction and homes in the suburbs. Urban neighborhoods, as opposed to suburban ones, often have older building stock and neighborhoods with lower property values that make them desirable. Finally, social factors such as an attitudinal and lifestyle change over a generation contributes to gentrification. Younger educated professionals with no children have a different set of social values and prefer to live in more active and vibrant neighborhoods than their parents. Suburbs. Researchers agree that gentrification may be in part due to reaction from the current generation to the perceived homogeneity of the suburbs. While the debate continues as to the causes of gentrification, all these hypotheses have some common factors. There is a consensus that both social and economic values play an essential role. The potential of a neighborhood, including the potential for rehabilitation, investment, and monetary gain, are also important factors. Further, location and the characteristics of older neighborhoods and the existing building stock play an essential role. The downside to unfettered economic development and gentrification is displacement. Displacement is the forced outflow of lower socioeconomic residents from their neighborhood. The biggest driver of displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods is the elimination of low-price rental housing. Existing residents are forced from their homes either through the loss of housing, increased rents, or harassment by landlords. Behaviors of harassment include cutting off utilities, failing to make necessary building repairs, or letting garbage accumulate. As new residents move in, they sometimes purchase properties or pay higher rents in newly rehabilitated rental units, making the existing neighborhood unaffordable for the low-income renters or homeowners who were there initially. Displacement has been caused by both private and public sector. Public sector projects like Home Ownership and Opportunity for People Everywhere, also known as Hope 6, includes the redevelopment of land previously occupied by public housing complexes. The inherent nature of removing public housing units and replacing them with mixed income developments, where only a small portion of the units are available to low-income residents, has meant that a number of public housing residents accommodated is insufficient. For example, one of the areas we'll look at had the villages of Park Duval in Louisville, in the Park Duval neighborhood. It's a Hope 6 project, or it was a Hope 6 project that produced significant displacement. Less than 5% of the residents from the previous public housing units returned to the newly built mixed income development. This low percentage is typical of most Hope 6 projects. Although affordable housing is provided in these mixed income projects, the original residents do not necessarily benefit. So the Hope 6 developments can also have a negative effect on local small businesses in the same way. Studies have been done where the loss of rich ethnic flavors in immigrant stores and restaurants that are in the community, as rents increase, owners sometimes are not able to continue to rent and provide their service. In addition to physical displacement, there's also many social costs of redevelopment, including political and cultural displacement. Residents who feel a detachment from place may opt to leave their economically transitioning neighborhood, causing them to miss out on any economic benefits from redevelopment in their community. Once existing residents leave, the neighborhood tends to lack diversity. After decades of moving away from the city, census data shows that since the year 2000, people have been moving back to urban centers, and the part of Louisville seem to be following this trend. The literature demonstrates that it is both millennials as well as older, higher socioeconomic status residents, educated white population, that have been moving back to the city, and shows that many middle-income professionals, those who service the city, providing necessary functions, can no longer afford to live there. In the cities where this type of gentrification has happened, unfortunately, it has resulted in displacement of the lower socioeconomic individuals. So I've limited my discussion to urban neighborhoods, but as I mentioned, there are gentrification happening in other spaces as well. I looked at urban neighborhoods because I was looking at historic data. So the selected neighborhoods are all close to the central business district, or the CBD, with the exception of two, Portland and Parkland, and I'll talk about them shortly. There are other historic districts in Louisville, but they were settled later and were predominantly white and more affluent. So just quickly touching on my methodology. So the methodology for this project took a case study approach with the city of Louisville, Kentucky as my selected city. I mapped the demographic shifts over time from 1940 to 2017 with a focus on race, education, and income, and the impacts of the laws, policies, and practices had on this demographic shift. And I created maps in Esri ArcMap to put the census data in, and we're going to take a look at some of those maps. So the timeline. So the date of 1933 was chosen because it was the year the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, was established. The HOLC was part of President Roosevelt's New Deal, and this legislation provided mortgage relief to homeowners and lending institutions. The importance of the HOLC is that a neighborhood rating system was devised, which evaluated properties based on location, physical conditions, and neighborhood characteristics. This was the impetus that created redlining in cities all across America, and Louisville was no exception. Other policies were chosen due to their potential impact on housing, urban planning, and their effects on displacement. For example, federal legislation on numerous housing acts, from the Housing Act of 1937 through to the Housing and Economic Recovery Act of 2008, all resulted in impacts to affordability across the United States. Urban renewal as part of the Housing Acts of 1949 and 54 resulted in the mass displacement of the poor and elimination of entire affordable neighborhoods. The Historic Preservation Act of 1966, along with local, state, and national designation and historic preservation districts, has impacted neighborhood redevelopment in both positive and negative ways. Finally, the recent past has seen the revitalization of many urban neighborhoods across the United States, providing a much-needed reinvestment, although often these redevelopment efforts have negatively affected low-income populations, resulting in displacement. So these are the National Register, the districts, the historic districts, and when they were registered. So you'll just see with these two slides that there are a lot of National Historic Registered districts in Louisville, both National Register and state registered. So just looking at some of the laws, policies, and incentives that impacted Louisville and the population. So prior to the 20th century, white and African-American residents in Louisville lived near one another. Before the Civil War, enslaved African-Americans lived in small cabins or shacks and alleys behind the main house. Immediately after emancipation, this proximity remained the same, but socio-legal changes at the turn of the century promoted segregation. More African Americans were employed outside of the domestic service industry, and due to improved transportation, many white people moved to the outskirts of the city. The new century also saw a nearly 100% increase in the African American population as people migrated to Louisville for employment and access to the north, thus placing a high demand on housing. These changes, along with a desire by whites to keep blacks out of their neighborhoods, led to segregation. Black ghettos in Louisville grew near the CBD and the adjacent neighborhoods, particularly Russell, which is west of the CBD, and Smoketown, which is east. Despite this, each was a vibrant community with schools, churches, businesses, public libraries, allowing the African American community to thrive. Downtown Louisville had a high rate of crime and slum housing. Many African Americans in these neighborhoods lived in substandard conditions with too few sewers, water mains, street lights, sidewalks, and paved streets. In 1910, 30% of the housing was identified as substandard and unfit for human habitation. These poor conditions were found in African American communities in the CBD and other parts of Louisville like Parkland and Smoketown. Unable to move due to economic limitations and the lack of available housing, African Americans were forced to remain in these poor conditions. However, African Americans that could afford to move out of the downtown ghetto were often moved further west into Russell, an entertainment and commercial hub, despite the white residents' opposition. The Louisville Segregation Ordinance was introduced in the fall of 1913 and passed with a unanimous decision of 21-0 in May of 1914, despite Black leaders' strong opposition. The ordinance restricted where African Americans could live. If African Americans moved into white neighborhoods, they would face arrest and fines. Led by Charles H. Parris of the NAACP, Louisville's African American leaders continued to fight the ordinance until the Supreme Court overturned it in a unanimous decision in 1917. Black residents, though no longer bound by the law, were still not able to move freely due to the pressures exerted by white residents. For example, the Shawnee neighborhood west of 32nd Street resisted integration, remaining a whites-only neighborhood until 1970. In 1937, a record-breaking flood devastated towns and cities across the Ohio River Valley. Louisville was severely hit, receiving 15 inches of rain in 1 week in January and more than 19 inches falling over the month. On January 23rd, the Ohio River crested at 51.1 feet, eventually reaching 57.15 feet above the flood stage. 2/3 of the city population, that's 175,000 people, had to be evacuated as 70% of the city was flooded. The most severely hit were the CBT, the western neighborhoods of Portland, Russell, Shawnee, and Butchertown to the east. It would take years for these neighborhoods to recover from the damages caused by the flood. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office and implemented the New Deal to help the nation escape the Great Depression, the Homeowners Loan Act of 1933 was enacted to help middle-class families enter the housing market, as well as those on the verge of losing their home. As part of the act, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, was created to define mortgages with new long-term lending practices. These new lending practices were unfortunately tarnished by redlining, which restricted African Americans from securing financing, resulting in significant disparities in home ownership. 4 years later, the National Housing Act of 1937 created the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. The law, which favored new suburban communities over those in the inner city, again prompted systematic racism. This was supported further by local covenants forbidding the sale or rental of housing to African Americans. Under the act, Louisville's Housing Authority created public housing projects in 1939, Clarksdale Housing Complex in Phoenix Hill reserved for white residents, and Beecher Terrace in Russell for African American residents only. By 1940, 14% of Louisville's population was African American. The city remained segregated, with the highest percentage of African Americans living adjacent to the CBD and communities to the west. Education levels in these areas were some of the lowest in Louisville, which is attributed to racial disparities in education and education policy. Brown v. Board of Education was not decided by the Supreme Court until 1954, and Louisville did not desegregate its schools until 1975. After the war, the Servicemen Readjustment Act, better known as the GI Bill, provided returning veterans with funding for education, unemployment insurance, and guaranteed home loans. The Veterans Administration, or the VA, was responsible for overseeing these programs. Notably, African Americans were not provided with the same benefits, but were denied mortgage subsidies and discouraged from applying to four-year college programs in favor of vocational schools. President Truman introduced his Housing Act in 1945, and it was enacted in Congress in 1949. The law introduced low-rent public housing for returning veterans and their families, as well as slum clearance and urban renewal. The latter allowed local government to condemn neighborhoods, clear the land, and sell it to private developers to jumpstart the economy through private investment. It took several years for the impacts of urban renewal to hit Louisville. The Cotter homes built in 1952 and Lang homes in 58 today, which were a part of the Park Duval neighborhood, taken over by the Hope 6 that I mentioned earlier, were originally a part of Little Africa, which I'll talk about in a minute, and that was raised for the public housing. The Housing Act of 1954 further cemented urban renewal, and the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act divided inner cities across the U.S. In Louisville, urban renewal projects continued to be implemented, including demolition for the construction of the I-65, then called the North-South Expressway. This project, which began in the summer of 1958, was completed in 1960, ran through downtown and Old Louisville, destroying residents and commercial properties in its wake. The 6-lane highway ran perpendicular to Broadway across through the west and side waterfronts. The federal and local policies impacted where people could live, how and whether they could own a home, and had lasting impacts on housing that can still be seen today. The data on housing, race, and education starting in the 1940 census indicate these impacts were immediate and persistent. This is reflected in the location and the concentration of African Americans in neighborhoods in Louisville. As I had mentioned earlier, the Homeowners Loan Act of 1933 had lasting repercussions on the nation. Prior to 1933, homeownership was out of reach for most working and middle-class families. A typical bank mortgage required 50% down, interest-only payments, and full repayment after a period of 5 to 7 years, after which the remainder of the debt was required in full. The homeowner would then need to refinance or secure another mortgage from a different bank. As part of the act, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created to refinance home mortgages that were subject to default and foreclosure. New terms and conditions, which included longer repayment schedules, initially 15 years and then moved to 25 years in 1938, with interest rates not exceeding 5 to 6% were established. The payment structure also changed. Rather than interest payments ending with a balloon payment, the HOLC amortized the loan so that once paid off, the home was owned free and clear. The HOLC also devised a system to evaluate properties along with the surrounding neighborhoods to gauge risk. The residential securities map, often referred to as redlining maps, were created. The practice of redlining was racially motivated. Property appraisals carried out by local real estate agents considered the racial composition of neighborhoods in their evaluation, and maintaining segregation was a part of their national ethics code. These residential security maps were graded, color-coded, and assigned a description of risk. Green was classified as A or best. Blue was B, still desirable. Yellow as C, definitely declining, and red as D, hazardous. The green or best neighborhoods were considered the safest, red the riskiest. An area would earn a red designation if African Americans or immigrants lived in them, regardless if they were stable middle-class neighborhoods or single-family homes. Banks use these assessments to approve or deny mortgages to African Americans. To ensure that loans had a low risk of default, the FHA did its own appraisals. Appraisal standards included a whites-only requirement, thereby creating an official racial divide. Racially mixed neighborhoods, as well as white neighborhoods close proximity to black ones that could integrate, were deemed risky. Initially, real estate agents were contracted as appraisals. As the popularity of the program grew, the FHA started hiring these contractors as employees, providing them with underwriters' manuals that were first issued in 1935. The FHA favored properties on the edges of the cities away from the inner city, allowing middle-class whites to move further away from the urban core. Urban neighborhoods with their older building stock were considered risky. Underwriting manuals in the 40s and the 50s continued to prohibit African Americans and any whites who might rent or lease to African Americans from obtaining issued mortgages. The HOLC and the FHA issued mortgages would have had an enormous impact on both the historic fabric of the city and the African American population. Federal housing laws were prolific in the 30s and the 40s. The Housing Act of 1949, particularly with its provision of slum clearance and urban renewal, had the most detrimental effect on the historic fabric and low-income, predominantly African-American population, reinforcing segregation and impoverishment. The Act provided local renewal agencies under the direction of the housing administrator the power of eminent domain and federal funding to condemn neighborhoods deemed blighted. The newly cleared land was then sold to private developers at a reduced price. The act was intended to stop white flight by stimulating large-scale private investment in cities, which would add to the tax revenue and revitalize the city's downtown. Despite promises that displaced families would be temporarily relocated and then provided permanent provisions of decent dwellings at prices and rents within the financial means, most of those displaced moved to other overcrowded slums. 2/3 of those displaced during urban renewal were African Americans. Data from the Urban Renewal Administrator shows that the cleared slums were replaced with predominantly luxury housing and only a few middle-class income projects. In some cases, however, neighborhoods were razed. Lack of market demand meant that no new construction ensued, leaving empty lots that remained vacant for years. This is an example of that in Louisville. Building highways was another way of eliminating slums, albeit under the guise of connecting the suburbs and the city. Entire neighborhoods were either eliminated or divided, mostly affecting urban African American communities. The process of urban renewal and highway creation had a devastating effect on displaced residents who were not able to return to their neighborhood, either because the neighborhood function changed from residential to commercial, or new housing was created for the middle and upper income groups that proved to be too costly for displaced residents. The wholesale destruction of neighborhoods rich with historic fabric did not go unnoticed. Activist and journalist Jane Jacobs came to the forefront of the preservation movement as she fought urban renewal and the highway development in New York Greenwich neighborhood. The turning point for preservation was the destruction of New York's Penn Station in 1966, which enacted the National Historic Preservation Act. So there's a lot of tax incentives, as you saw on that other slide. The ones that I wanted to specifically mention were the historic tax credit, and which which allows a tax credit for somebody rehabilitating a historic property. Associated with that, that's a federal policy, and there's also, most states have a state historic tax credit. And then with that, there is a low-income housing tax credit, which was part of the 1986 Tax Reform Act. This has allowed for a lot of affordable housing in the readaptation of historic properties. Developers and builders can combine the low-income housing tax credit with the historic preservation tax credit federally and provincial and statewide. So in the early 1990s, urban revitalization demonstrated the Hope 6 projects. So this is an example of one of the neighborhoods, Smoketown, that's going to be undergoing a Hope 6 project. In the past, Hope 6 has proved to displace. As I mentioned, there's only usually 5% of people that return to the neighborhood. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Smoketown. So this is the neighborhoods and the findings. So this is just a map of Louisville and their neighborhoods, and these are the neighborhoods that I looked at. It was the CBD, or the Central Business District, Russell, Portland, Parkland, and those are all on the west side. Centrally located was Limerick and Old Louisville, and on the east side was Smoketown, Phoenix Hill, and Butchertown. So Louisville's existence was based in its proximity to the Ohio River, and it was settled in 1782 and planned in 1783. It is full of 19th century tall buildings with decorative cast iron that appeared in Louisville's Main Street, and it is the second largest number of cast iron facades in the world, second to New York Soho's district. These are some of the examples of that in Louisville. As the city grew, the city center activity centered around the riverfront, and eventually the construction of the Louisville and Portland Canal led to the rapid growth of commerce in Louisville in the 1800s. And many people were living in these 2- and 3-story brick stone houses. Immigration changed as the streetcars changed, and people moved and had the flexibility to move to Russell and Old Louisville, as transportation was not restricted by river. So this is just some of the maps that I created. I won't go into detail with this, but you can see the examples of population, college educated, and the poverty thresholds of what the Central Business District had from 1970. So this is the Russell neighborhood. The Russell neighborhood was named after a prominent African-American educator, Harvey Clarence Russell Sr., and moved to the area in 1926. Before it was identified as Russell, the eastern portion of the neighborhood was adjacent to the CBD and home to many free African-Americans, families before the Civil War. So from the onset, Russell was rich in both character and in Black and white residents and businesses. By 1890s, affluent whites began leaving Russell for Louisville's newly developed eastern and southern suburban neighborhoods, which are still part of Louisville today. But middle-class African-Americans would then be able to move into Russell, escaping from the more crowded Central Business District. One of the important things in Russell was that it was home to the first western branch of Louisville Free Public Library for Blacks, and it was opened in 1908. The Louisville segregation ordinance in 1914 obviously slowed migration of Blacks into predominantly white neighborhoods, but it did eventually happen, and by 1940, Russell was a predominantly Black neighborhood. So this is just Russell's population mix. You could see from 1940 and then the education levels. And then this is the looking at 1960 levels for the population, the college educated, and poverty thresholds. Again, I'll just let you look at some of the data. It's difficult to go over it all in detail, but you can just sort of see by looking at the intensity of color of the population from 1980 through to 2017 is predominantly African American, and the college level education levels are fairly low. Okay, just moving on to Portland. Portland was founded in 1800 and was considered a suburb as it was further away from the central business district. It was its own town, founded in 1800, and it had a thriving river port town that would use the site as a portage business, and it flourished, taking people over the falls from the Ohio River, and then they would be transported to Louisville and get onto either another ship or the same ship. So the town grew, including a wharf, warehouse, taverns, and foundries. The flood of 1937 also adversely affected Portland, as it's right on the Ohio River. The neighborhood was predominantly white from a lot of immigrants, though. So that was one of the reasons, if you noticed on the redlining map that it was considered red, is because it was predominantly immigrants living there. And this is moving on to Parkland, which was initially known as Homestead. It was a suburb. It's now a part of Louisville, but it was first settled in 1871 and incorporated in 1874. Little Africa is a part of Parkland, Parkland's African-American enclave that today consists of parts of Parkland, Chickasaw, and Park Duval. The African-American community settled after the Civil War was located southwest of the central Parkland on 32nd Street in a certain area that was all Black neighborhood established in Louisville in the 1800s. So as you maybe remember, Parkland has those two public housing units. So Little Africa was raised to create those two public housing units, and then those were raised for the Hope 6 mixed income. So Little Africa was a prominent neighborhood, and Black educated people were trying to help with the station of people's lives and looked to increase the neighborhood with street leveling, mailboxes, cinder blocks. But in 1916, the 700 homes, and by 1916, there were 700 homes in Little Africa. But the community fabric changed when the Cotter homes in 52 and the Lang homes in 58 were created, and then raised in 96 to make room for the Hope 6 development. So Limerick was is close to Louisville, to Old Louisville, and it was predominantly an Irish immigrant population, which is where the name came from. And but although many African Americans did live in there, a lot of people worked at the Louisville and Nashville railroad line. So that was the main work for the immigrants. And it faced significant changes at the turn of the century because the railroad was not as significant, and then many Irish workers moved. The educated their children were now moving away as they had different jobs. They were more white-collar jobs rather than the laborers that they were initially. So again, just some data showing the populations. There's a couple districts in here. So this one actually has Parkland, so I'm just going to flip through here. This is Old Louisville. So despite the name of Old Louisville, it is not the oldest neighborhood in the city. It had intense development in the 1880s from an exhibition, which I'll mention in a second. So the neighborhood gained that moniker in the early 1960s when preservationists were seeking to retain the neighborhood's unique character. This was the layout of the Southern Exposition, which was really the impetus for the growth of Old Louisville. And the exposition covered 45 acres with a central park. So the impact of the show was quickly evident as 260 homes were built in 1885 alone. These homes were predominantly Queen Anne and Romanesque, followed by Chateauesque and Renaissance Revival. In addition to those houses, a neighborhood, St. James Court, was created, and it was set on that land that was cleared by the Exposition. So this new development contained a grass mall with a carriageway on either side of the impressive fountain feature in the center, and there was a deed restriction. The house needed to be constructed of brick or stone, and this is one of the historic districts in Old Louisville. This is one of the homes that's on the National Register. It's the Conrad Caldwell House, and it is currently a house museum, and that's in Old Louisville. Again, just some information on the neighborhood level when it comes to African American population and college education. And here we have the time frame of 1960, and then we have college educated for 1970 and 1980. So you can see that it is changing in Old Louisville. It's a predominantly white neighborhood, even though the African American population was centered around the central business district. Urban renewal projects, though, did go through Old Louisville and did impact that neighborhood, as well as Russell, Phoenix Hill, and the central business district. So Smoketown was a predominantly African-American community. It's the only surviving neighborhood in Louisville that has a continuous presence of African-Americans before the Civil War. And the name alleges from the enormous amounts of smoke produced by the neighborhood from the brick kilns. So some of the settlements were German immigrants initially. After the German immigrants moved away, many freed African Americans made Smoketown their home, and it has been a predominantly African American community. It is, as I mentioned earlier, having a Hope 6 redevelopment project, so we'll see whether that impacts the population of the neighborhood. So here you can see that in 2017, there is a little bit less. Most of the neighborhood has been 76 to 100% African American. And then in 2017, it dropped to 50 to 74%. So the demographics were changing in that area. And this is Phoenix Hill. Phoenix Hill is directly east of the Central Business District, and it was part of a land grant from 1774, and it was densely populated by German immigrants. And there's a lot of history. It's a smaller neighborhood, but before it was developed, it had a brewery and a park. So prior to Prohibition, it had a skating rink, bowling lanes, dance floor, and a stage, and it was really an entertainment hub. But after Prohibition, things changed, and the buildings were torn down in 1938. Phoenix Hill is predominantly German until the 1940s, and the residents began leaving for the suburbs, and African Americans began moving in. Again, just to look at some of the statistic information. And then Butchertown. Butchertown was first settled in the late 1700s, and it was not until 1827 when it was annexed to Louisville. And the major character began to develop. So a lot of German settlers went to Butchertown, and the neighborhood derived its name because of the fact that it was the center of butchering animals, as it was banned in the city core. So the industry established itself in Butchertown, close to the proximity of the core. And it was close to access to the Ohio River. So farmers who wanted their product to make it to the south, to the deep south, came to Louisville for this ideal location for that. So the industry grew related all to the animals, the stockyards, related businesses, tanneries were built, and the industry grew from there. Butchertown is actually one of the areas I think that is undergoing gentrification currently, as its proximity to the central business district, and there's a lot of adaptive reuse of tanneries. That's an old tannery on the left-hand side, and sort of it's now a market, so it's changed. Butchertown, though, was also affected by that flood that I talked about earlier, so it displaced a lot of the initial population. So again, just some of the data of what Butchertown is. Again, some African-American population around closer to the tip of the central business district, but otherwise it's a predominantly white population. So these are just the maps that I created. So I just wanted to take a closer look at the areas. So again, the central business district, Russell, Portland, Parkland, then Limerick, and Old Louisville, and Phoenix Hill, Smoketown, Phoenix Hill, and Butchertown. So these are the maps that I created. So I will just show the maps, and this is what it looks like. So you'll notice that over time, the boundaries expand. So in 1940, the boundaries for Louisville as a city were quite small with those initial urban neighborhoods. But between 1950 and 60, it grew to encompass all of Jefferson County, which is that whole area. So that's why you'll notice that the maps change in size. So hopefully. So as you can see, the African-American population, the higher the darker the blue, the higher the African-American population. And I have the same for college educated. So the darkest gray blue color highlights the highest number of college educated people, and the lightest blue gray signifies the lowest number of college educated people. And the next one is poverty. So the areas in poverty are identified with the light green color. The darker the dark green identifies areas that are not below the poverty threshold. So this is just poverty. So light green is poverty, dark green is not. And then lastly, this is median income. So median income is displayed as a range of green, with the lightest as the areas with the lowest median income, and the darkest green is as the areas with the highest median incomes. Okay, so I just wanted to give a little bit of a summary of my thoughts and a quick quick look at the Russell neighborhood. As we just saw, so the lighter green are areas in poverty, and the darker the blue, the higher the African American population is. So you can actually just sort of take a look at each of the maps from 1950, 80, and then 2010, and the corresponding information. So then here is the education and the race. So college educated, the lighter, the blue-gray area, the lower level of college educated, and the darker is the higher levels. And again, the darker the blue, the higher the African American population. So the Russell neighborhood had a historic district for well over 40 years. Designation of a historic district in this neighborhood has not created or exacerbated gentrification, but time will only tell, as neighborhoods are always changing. This is not the case for all neighborhoods that we have looked at. Many factors influence gentrification and displacement. Understanding these factors and ensuring existing residents are taken into consideration when redevelopment occurs can help to ensure older residents can benefit from the same attractions as the new residents. Since 1930s, the federal, state, and local policies and practices, many of them racist, have affected low-income and minority residents. Redlining, as an example, hindered African Americans from purchasing homes and accumulating wealth through home ownership. As a response to large-scale demolition of urban renewal, the preservation movement was spearheaded on a grassroots level and became a comprehensive law to protect the historic fabric of older communities. Tax incentives connecting preservation, as well as low-income housing tax credits, can be used in conjunction to retain the historic fabric through adaptive reuse while housing low-income families and seniors. The significance of this research shows how racist laws, policies, and practices of the past have impacted people in Louisville, specifically African Americans. The maps show that the areas that have historically been African American have remained African American neighborhoods, many having the lowest levels of college-educated people, as well as being in poverty both historically and today. By understanding these impacts, future redevelopment projects can be better planned. The information can be used by both community members and city planners. Redevelopment must be addressed with foresight to ensure that all residents are treated justly. For example, comprehensive plans should factor in the loss of low-income housing units. Community benefits agreements could be put in place with developers to provide for specific needs of the community, and planning ordinances could incorporate inclusionary zoning and specific requirements for new or rehabilitated development to ensure replacement of new low-income housing if there is a net loss due to redevelopment. Adaptive reuse of the historic fabric is also another way to accommodate low-income housing. In the Russell neighborhood, an underutilized school was rehabilitated into low-income senior housing. The significance of historic preservation is that historic preservation is not a panacea, as some would like to believe, nor is it the evil that others claim. Many more factors are at play than simply designating a historic district. The research has also shown that in Louisville, historic preservation has not necessarily led to gentrification. In some neighborhoods like Butchertown and Old Louisville, historic preservation efforts spurred redevelopment efforts and has led to displacement of poor residents. Old Louisville's gentrification began over 40 years ago, whereas Butchertown has been more recent, seeing economic and social changes since the new millennium. Other areas like Portland and Parkland, although having designated historic districts for almost 40 years, have not seen signs of gentrification. The other neighborhoods of Limerick, Smoketown, and Phoenix Hill have not seen gentrification take hold, but could potentially be targets. Understanding why some districts gentrify and others don't could aid in future planning, ensuring that any new developments or redevelopments consider displacement and low-income housing, especially in poorer neighborhoods, that could allow existing residents the opportunity to remain, limiting social and cultural impacts. Neighborhoods change and the people who live within them change as well. Visualizing these shifts by looking at past examples may allow for making more informed predictions for actions. Gentrification is a slow process, and changes happen to neighborhoods over a long period of time. By understanding the influencing factors to gentrification in a particular neighborhood, foresight could mitigate displacement. Thank you for taking your time with me this morning.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That was really, really interesting. As a historian, I greatly appreciate the amount of research that has gone into all of this data. And again, I think really, really important to point out how historically and still today, things that can seem at first face value very neutral, like urban development and highway construction and historic preservation. Like, well, who could be against any of those things? They're all such good things. And yet behind the scenes, there can be all kinds of complex and rather disturbing social trends. So thank you very much for that. Now, if you have questions for Katrina, and we certainly hope that you do, this will be the process. All will need to do is raise your hand, and Dr. Theo Finnegan will be our runner. He'll bring the microphone to you so that when you ask your question, everyone can hear it. But while you're composing your thoughts and thinking about a good question to ask, I would like to remind you that this year's Arts and Humanities Colloquium Series will continue on Friday morning, November 25th. At that time, VIU Theatre Professor Eliza Gardner will take us on a personal and scholarly journey into the world of musical theater as she shares some tunes from her original musical narrative, Concessions of a Wannabe Rock Star, while also discussing some of the poetic structure and the use of metaphor and inspiration behind the songs in her show. Sounds like a great day indeed. So, without any further ado, then, if you would have a question for Katrina, and again, I really appreciated all the images too. It helped to really transport us to those neighborhoods. I thought that was fantastic. So, there's Theo up there, just waiting for someone to raise their hand and jump into the process for a question.
Around the other corner. Try shouting. Yeah, I'll try and I'll get there and yeah.
So thanks, Katrina, Eliza here. I love all of the visuals as well. But noticing some of those filmed map evolution scenes that there's a great swath, it seems to me, kind of down the middle of the map. And I wonder if you looked at that area that seemed to be leading to downtown. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of it, but it looked like it was evolving as well in regard to the population dynamics and the poverty levels. Was there something distinct about that middle chunk down the middle?
So there was Old Louisville, sort of. If you went to the center of the map and then moved down, there's Old Louisville. But just below Old Louisville is the airport area. So that because and it's been under construction. So when there was construction, you'll notice that some of it happened to be. It showed that it was in poverty because the airport authority took over the land. So people had to move, and then the airport authority took it. So. And I think it was 2010 when you noticed maybe it was in 2010 that you noticed some of that area. So there was some other changes that were happening in other neighborhoods that impacted that. And there were some neighborhoods that some African Americans had moved to in the suburbs once, probably in the later 70s and 80s, that became, more I guess, diversified, but the downtown area is predominantly African American from the central business district to the west side. If you remember seeing those maps, the darker blue was 76 to 100% African American. So that's predominantly where they would live, which is where they were initially or historically lived because of where they worked, where they were enslaved, and then where they were restricted in living. So not being able to move to the suburbs for the very long time was part of that as well. So.
Hi. Oh, okay.
Hi.
I was just curious to know for the maps, how all of that data was collected.
So I created the maps in Esri ArcMap. So I taught myself how to use the software, and I used census data. So I'm sure it's probably the same here, but you can grab the decanal data that you need or the data that you need. So that was one of the limiting factors that I had with looking at the year that I could start. So I wanted to start earlier, but there just wasn't specific census data available. So that's why the maps didn't start till 1940, even though the 1933 was my starting line for the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So it was through census data, and the IPUMS NHGIS through the university, I think it's the University of Minnesota, has all of that data. So I collected it from there and then populated the maps.
Katerina, thank you very much. But this was fascinating and so much information that for me was completely new. It's Dawn Thompson from the English department. And I wondered if you can, I know it wasn't your area of research, but I wonder if you can speak at all about how this kind of research, what it might look like in a more local context. Like I think about Hogan's Alley in Vancouver and the Georgia Viaduct coming through that and what happened. But then I started thinking, wondering about like the various locations of Chinatowns in Nanaimo. And I wondered if any of the laws and like the notion of redlining, whether they there's sort of parallel developments in Canadian history, if you at all looked into that, because it just made me picture where I am to try to. I'd love to see the research. I'd love to see you do another research project that's here.
Yeah, I don't have, the data that I looked at was specifically American, so I don't have any information on what happened locally or in Vancouver. But so I'm speaking from assumptions here and just from what I know from looking at research. This is not uniquely this was a case study of Louisville, but it happened all over the United States. And I am sure that with the issues that we have had in our past with racism, that I'm sure that is a factor. Although I have not done the research, I don't have any specific data for it. You're right, it would be a very interesting, as I was preparing for this, I lived in the States and I used Louisville as the city. But, if I had done it here, it would have been more interesting in the Canadian context to sort of see what this would have been, or sort of now having done one, paralleling that would be interesting to see. So, if I ever win the lottery and decide to do a different degree, then maybe, but yeah. So I can't really speak specifically, but I would think that there would be parallels to the same things that were happening, because it's not unique to one city in the United States.
Just out of curiosity, all this influence. I'm wondering what sort of influence the University of Louisville might have had in terms of, obviously it wasn't sort of near to your neighbors necessarily. I'm wondering whether it might come up kind of the right-hand corner, but there's heavy concentration of higher education there. Because I know, even here in Nanaimo, I think part of the gentrification you see going on around us is rooted in VIU's housing district.
Yes, actually, universities, in my studies, universities are probably one of the worst for gentrification. University of Louisville is actually closer to Old Louisville, which I think is one of the reasons. Historically, if you look at a lot of data, there are higher educated people, obviously closer to the university because of the function of the university, and less poverty. So Old Louisville, the more southern part, is where the University of Louisville is. So that's why I think that information, and the fact that Old Louisville has a lot of historic, the historic fabric has remained, even though it has transitioned through lots of stages. In the 80s, it was poverty with the urban renewal parts going through there, but that's where the university is located. So, yeah. And Louisville was about an hour away from Lexington, so. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but more on observation, I guess. Watching explain the historical and also the impacts of the laws impacting where people live and location, poverty, and how we can able to take the planet, because part of the position
on this line to where a neighborhood cannot only have certain level of house or certain income, and a diversity would be mandatory, maybe it would be a reverse, like we haven't seen historically. It's just like, as you're presenting us, well, what I thought it was, a different approach, not literally like instead to be drawn a line, and this income, low income people live this side of the city, and higher income, this beautiful large homes of earth, whatever. If it was mandatory, that there would be a diversity within the neighborhood in terms of that probably would help. I don't know the implications of that to be on the US study, but I just felt like that was interesting to read that idea of the cost is diversification.
Well, yeah, and I think that's one of the things of looking at this is that you kind of know what happened and what could happen, and there's a lot of different things that we can do, and part of it is developers are often just looking to make the most amount of money, and often you can negotiate, and the city or whoever is issuing this needs to be able to negotiate to accommodate, like the mixed income housing, if it's going to be something that's not just public housing. There's a lot of concentrated poverty in just high-rise public housing. I didn't even get into that, but that is something that's happened in Chicago and a lot of other in Atlanta. So that's why they started going with mixed income, because it does add diversity. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we could do. It's just that I think people are afraid to, and maybe city officials are afraid to make things mandatory in hopes that they will just spur some development. But as you can see, gentrification takes years and years and decades to change a neighborhood. So if there was foresight in looking at neighborhood change and making sure that it was not displacing current residents, then I think it would be a much more interesting neighborhood, because that's why people like it, because of the character that it has at the time that people start moving into it. And then once it becomes all one thing again, it changes and it's lost that character, that quality. So it would be interesting, but yeah, you can do research on that one.
Our unique location here, and I know you didn't go into that. I guess I'm with Dawn, where I'm trying to think about how interesting it would be to do exactly what you did here. And in particular, I think about the Gulf Islands and how, as a person who lived on Gabriola for quite a few years, I saw a lot of change happen there, and I just wonder how, and highways too. How does the highway affect all of our landscapes and the way we live? And because you can see it happening right now here. I wondered if that, you must have been thinking perhaps about that when you were you thinking about that when you were in, thinking about Nanaimo?
Well, when I was in Lexington doing this, I was not thinking about Nanaimo at the time. But when I was preparing this, I did think about it a lot and tried to sort of see, how interesting it would have been to present my data in a place where it, say this was on Nanaimo, on the effects, or the Gulf Islands, or, but so you talk about Gabriola, Salt Spring is kind of the same thing. Salt Spring has changed the characters, and I guess the neighborhoods change, cities change all the time, but it has gotten to a point where things are really unaffordable for even people who make good wages. So it's a matter of, it's a matter of addressing it in a way that we don't want to stop development, but we need to think about it, I think, as a whole, rather than just letting bits and pieces happen and get developed. I think there needs to be a better comprehensive plan. And I know every city in town has sort of a community plan, or should have a community plan, but I'm not sure how much foresight is given to that, knowing, because there's a lot of research that would have to go into who's currently there, what's the age, what's the demographic, what's the education, median income, all that kind of stuff, and then to know where things are going. But yeah, that would be interesting.
Oh, right.
I was just curious now that you've completed your project, if you plan on personally keeping yourself updated with the data and statistics on the topic.
I'm not sure that I'm going to sort of do it formally. I am really interested. I mean, I spent a lot of time getting to know Louisville and getting to know these 9 historic neighborhoods. The Russell neighborhood, Beecher Terrace, which was built in 1938, was actually torn down in I think it started in 2017 or 2018, and they are putting in a new community development in there, and that's supposed to be completed in 2024. They did approach it because it's predominantly African American, and it was low income housing. So it's interesting. They did document a lot of the problem with looking at displacement is that it's not really well documented. So they actually, with this project, they actually tried to interview and document people who are currently living in Beecher Terrace and to see how many people come back. So there is something that people are doing on the ground, trying to keep people within the Russell neighborhood. So that's something that I'm following. I also know that while I was refreshing my data for the presentation, Smoketown is going to be undergoing one of these urban their housing is going to be undergoing some revitalization. So tearing down some public housing and adding to that. And those often lead to gentrification. So it's interesting to see those are both predominantly African-American communities, although Smoketown, I am not aware of them doing the same thing that Russell did, trying to account for displacement and trying to really mitigate it. So that's one that I'm following because I'd like to sort of see their data in the future to see whether they were able to have less displacement, whether more people came back who lived in Beecher Terrace came back to that neighborhood. Because like I said, it's across Hope 6 or across those projects, it's usually less than 5% of the population who live there come back. They're just, and it makes sense. People move, they settle, they don't necessarily want to pick up and move again, although they would benefit the most from the advantages that happen, the changes that happen to that neighborhood. If I ever have time from marking, I might look at that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Katrina.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.